He was in his early 20s, and he went to the University of Chicago and was looking for something to photograph. And he had built a motorcycle actually in his dorm room and found a club to ride with. That turned out to be the Chicago Outlaws, which then turned into one of the largest motorcycle gangs in the world, second only to the Hells Angels. And he rode with them for most of 1965, and in 1968, he first published this book. I should say though, when he was 19, Danny, the son of a dentist in New York, traveled down to Georgia to photograph the Civil Rights Movement, and he became John Lewis's roommate. And he took some of the most iconic civil rights photographs that you've probably seen, and that's when he was 19. So that was before he did the Bikeriders. And when I went to go see him, he lives part of the year in New Mexico. He was very gracious to me, and I sat down and I started to explain, I want to make a film about subculture, and I think there's this cycle in society, and I kind of blathered for like 30 minutes. And he shook his head and he was like, so you don't want to make a movie about a photographer? But to answer your question, yeah, the photographs alone, if you only take the photographs, they're inspirational. But when you combine them with these select interviews that he did, he was really into new journalism. So he didn't want to just write, his thoughts. He really wanted to put it in the words of the people that he interviewed. So they read like monologues. So a lot of the dialogue is there are pieces of it that are directly taken from that. And when you combine the photographs, which are romantic, even though they're certainly greasy and kind of rough, when you combine them though with the interviews, you get this really complete picture of a subculture and of human beings. And that's what most interests me.
Yeah, the film is incredibly immersive into this world, into their world. And starting with a photo book can get you to a certain level, but obviously there's an enormous amount of care and specificity that is from your brain, and I imagine further research. So how did you go about working the screenplay out exactly, and particularly settling on what's a pretty complex structure, I think?
Yeah, it took a while, because there was no narrative. And so the first thing that kind of popped up was the idea of this love triangle, which obviously wasn't represented anywhere in the interviews. There was a real Kathy, and she talked about a real Benny, and her opening, kind of story about walking into that bar and him sitting outside of her house all night. That was there, but this idea that there would be the leader of this club that would also be infatuated by this young writer, that's kind of where I started to come in. And that started to become, I guess to use a term, that started to become the plot. I knew that I wanted it to show the overarching, shape of the club from the late 50s to the early 70s, from a regional club to something that kind of metastasizes into something more violent by the early 70s. I knew that shape would be there, but it was really that plot and those character dynamics that I had to come up with. But when I talk about subculture, like a big part of that is the way people look, the way they dress, and their style. I was really inspired by the punk rock scene in the mid-90s in Little Rock, Arkansas, of all places. And you would see these kids, and they looked like they'd stumbled out of the gutter, but then you're like, oh, no. Like, the way they wear their jeans, the way they wear their hair, everything is so specific. It's really a defining element of a subculture. And I knew from looking at these photographs that we had to get that right. And that's where Aaron comes in.
Yeah, I think that the greatest thing that Jeff has always done is been able to communicate a character to me. So, we didn't even need to talk about, denim and leather and all the things like that, or, all the details that did eventually go into it, but it was more just about Jeff being able to communicate you know, who is Cal and who is Zipco, and, you know, all those pictures of them are actually, they are the characters. So we kind of like, we actually really modeled each character after a real one. So it was, in a way, it was very easy.
Sure. You know about the 1,000 patches that you sewed on and the hundreds of jeans you had to age and dye. And they had this person walking around with this sack of dirt, and they would just throw dirt on people.
It sounded that dirty. It was so much dirtier.
Well, there was one photograph in particular, and the book that I was drawn to actually was a 2003 reissue, which was really important because the original book didn't have color photographs. But the first book that I encountered did. And there's this one, it's the character Cal, and he's sitting on his bike at a gas station. And the density of color, you know, I shared it with each department and was like, if we can have a frame in our film that looks this dense, then we've succeeded. And you have to look at the grease in their fingernails and the way they sewn these patches on, and all of the details. And Aaron, which is amazing, you know, I think today we see this and we think, well, they look like bikers, but you really have to look at all the detail that they've put in, because the characters are different and they have their own personalities and they are kind of expressing their own characters through the way they dress and the way they have their hair and how that shifts throughout the course of a decade. So it's an immense amount of work. I just want to make sure everybody hears that. It begins and the bottom rockers are all Chicago, but it starts to grow through the Midwest. So we start adding Milwaukee and Cincinnati and Columbus and all these other things. So everything, it wasn't stationary. It all had to evolve through the course of the decade too. So, and then for the sound, you know, this was the first time Amanda and I worked together. She was on set with us, and I thought did a beautiful job because we didn't make her life easy.
There were a few trains and a few bikes.
Motorcycles are not quiet, but you did an incredible job capturing the sounds, and I mean, she had microphones everywhere. Trying to get the unique quality of these bikes because they're like characters. And there was this beautiful handoff then from Amanda to Will. And Will and I went to college together, so we've known each other for a very long time. He's worked on really all my films. I think I can say that because you even took past the Shaka Stories at some point.
Technically.
Yeah, technically. And you know, it just so happens that a friend of mine from college turned out to be one of the greatest sound designers in town. But yeah, I mean, we knew when we were on set, and Amanda can attest to this, when you stand in the middle of 40 motorcycles, 40 1960s Harley Davidson motorcycles, you feel something. You literally feel something. And we needed that represented in the film, and that's what we're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Jeff's movies always have a lived-in quality, and we always try to embody that with the way we approach the sound. And one of the main things, of course, is we try to be as authentic as possible, and that means not using ADR whenever we possibly can. Although we did do a fun thing in this one, where we got a couple of the actors together just to riff and like just have background chatter that like literally Jeff directed them, and like we had like little scenes, little vignettes happening in the back of some of these scenes that you might not have even really clocked, but it gives an energy to the scene that's sort of like an adjunct to what's happening on the screen.
It's insane when your background actors are Michael Shannon and Boyd Holbrook.
Right.
It's like, you guys, can you just do some roll-ups? Talk it up.
But you know, that was the real challenge on this film in particular, is how do you make it feel authentic? You know, how do you really, I think the key, usually there's always one scene, and that's the scene that we use to figure out how the movie's gonna sound. For this one, it was absolutely when she's on the back of Penny's bike, and she first feels what it feels like to be surrounded by all those motorcycles, just like you were just saying. And that was, once we figured out how to make it feel like that to her, because that was really the moment of the film that she has to fall in love with not only Penny, but also with motorcycle culture. and accept that she's basically gonna have to share her life with these machines and him. And so it was really important, we had to really approach that as a kind of a tender scene in a funny way, even though it's about these, 20 machines roaring around her, but the approach to it was very romantic, I think. And part of that too was we had a chance to have so much fun with all this great needle drop music in the film. And we did a thing that I've never really seen done to the degree that we did. We took all these, 60-year-old songs, and we used the latest technology, which lets us basically split the songs apart into, drums and bass and guitar and background vocals. And we were able to actually take these songs and kind of reassemble them in ways that let us use them as a score more than they could if we just hit play. And it also you probably heard, we really went deep with, surrounding the audience with the music as much as possible. Some of these songs were recorded in mono. So, it was like kind of a difficult thing, and it was quite a challenge to, when Jeff said, I don't really want to use score, I really want to try to make these songs work. And then there was the exploration of, well, how do we then take what these songs are, the core, and then expand on it, so that they can really function the way that we needed them to function emotionally with film.
It wasn't lost on me that I was making a film about American masculinity. And, there are so many, tropes about masculinity. Things that hopefully, as a society that we live in today, we understand aren't really true. Men can actually share their emotions and show them. Men can actually cry, despite what Kathy's character says in the film. And I think, violence is, in this particular context, it's just one more way that these guys are desperately trying to express themselves. They're very inarticulate in that regard. And it manifests as violence. And that's really the way I saw it here. I don't like violence, and I don't think it's particularly romantic. But I knew it was a part of this subculture. But I also think it's interesting how, at one point, it can almost feel like a sense of camaraderie in the violence. And then by the end, it is just exactly what it is, wholly destructive.